The air inside the conference center felt unusually warm that afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows and drew faint, golden lines across the carpeted hallway. I had been reviewing a client file, preparing for the second half of a negotiation workshop, when my phone lit up silently on the table beside me. The name glowing on the screen was one I had seen thousands of times, yet in that moment, I felt an instinctive heaviness settle in my chest. Tyler. He rarely called when I traveled for work. He preferred texting quick, detached messages that required no emotional effort. So seeing his name flash across my phone during a work trip felt odd. Not worrying, just out of character enough to make me excuse myself politely and step into the hallway. The space was quiet, save for the muffled hum of distant conversations. My footsteps softened on the carpet as I walked toward a narrow stretch of sunlight, where the warmth touched the side of my face. I remember thinking it was going to be something small. Maybe he had forgotten where I stored the spare sheets. Maybe he needed an account password. Maybe, just maybe, he wanted to ask if the trip was going well. I answered the call with a simple hello. His voice sliced through the quiet like a sudden draft of cold air. Amelia, listen. I'm divorcing you. No pause. No softening. No hesitation. As if he had rehearsed the words in front of a mirror. I felt my fingers tighten around the phone, not out of anger or fear, but sheer bewilderment. I waited for his tone to shift into something more familiar, something human. But instead, he continued speaking with a calm arrogance that pulled the floor out from under me. And I've already sold our apartment to start my life with my new girlfriend. Enjoy looking for a new place. I had heard the line before. Not in reality, but in the stories other women whispered when they talked about betrayal. Words spoken by men who were certain they had outgrown the person who carried them through their hardest years. But hearing that same cruelty directed at me, delivered casually over the phone while I stood in another state, felt surreal. There was a pause. A breath. A laugh. A laugh that told me he believed he had won something. It was the same laugh the thumbnail would later echo, frozen in a single moment of arrogance. My husband called me while I was visiting a client in another state. I'm divorcing you. Enjoy looking for a new place, he laughed. I remember the stillness that followed. How the hallway around me seemed to absorb every word. How even the soft humming of the building felt far away. Tyler expected an explosion. He expected tears or panic or trembling silence. Instead, I inhaled deeply, letting my breath expand slowly in my chest, and replied in a tone that neither trembled nor revealed anything I was feeling. Sounds good. It was the only power I had in that moment, to deny him the reaction he wanted, and so I gave him nothing. He hung up. No goodbye. No explanation. Not even a courtesy pause to see if I had heard him. The call ended and the world around me returned in muffled fragments. The distant laughter inside the conference room. The soft click of someone's heels turning a corner. The slow passing of a maintenance cart rolling across the hallway. Life continued. And yet mine had just cracked open in a way I hadn't seen coming. I stood there for several seconds, maybe minutes, I'm not entirely sure. Feeling the weight of the phone still in my hand. Shock moves strangely through the body. It doesn't always arrive like fire. Sometimes it moves like water, cool and slow, filling every space inside you until you're too full to feel anything at all. I walked back into the meeting room with a practiced smile and took my seat. The clients continued discussing strategy while I nodded at the appropriate moments, though my thoughts drifted back to the call again and again, replaying his words, examining them like broken pieces of glass. I've already sold our apartment. New girlfriend. Enjoy looking for a new place. A marriage isn't supposed to end in a hallway. It isn't supposed to end with a smirk over the phone. But maybe marriages don't end in the moments we imagine. Maybe they end quietly, long before the final blow. Maybe they end in all the nights he came home late without apology. In all the mornings he kissed me on the forehead instead of the lips. In all the small dismissals I ignored because loving someone sometimes makes you blind to the ways they're pulling away. The meeting lasted another hour, though I could not recount a single detail from it. When it ended, I gathered my notes mechanically, thanked everyone with a warm professionalism I barely felt, and returned to my hotel room with a slow, steady walk. The room greeted me with its sterile calm. White sheets, beige curtains, a faint lemon scent from housekeeping. I set my bag down gently on the bed and sank into the desk chair, letting the room settle around me. Only then did my mind begin to process what had happened. Tyler was leaving me. Tyler had a girlfriend. Tyler had laughed. Tyler had sold our apartment. Except he hadn't. Because months earlier, after a refinance, the deed had been moved into my name alone. Not because I anticipated betrayal, but because Tyler never cared about paperwork. He signed what I placed in front of him, trusting me to handle the details. He never bothered to ask questions. Never checked. Never wondered why his signature appeared where it did. He had sold an apartment he didn't own. And he didn't know. The truth settled inside me like a quiet ember. Not burning, not bright, just warm enough to keep me steady. Tyler thought he had taken everything from me. But he had no idea the ground he stood on was already slipping away. He had no idea the apartment he claimed to have sold would be the very thing that destroyed the illusion of power he thought he had. I opened my laptop with calm hands and typed one name into my email. Chloe. My lawyer. My oldest friend. A woman who never once doubted my strength even when I did. I wrote her a brief message explaining what had happened. There was no anger in my words. No panic. Just facts. She called me within 3 minutes. What did he do? She asked, her voice tight with disbelief. When I repeated his claim about selling the apartment, she didn't respond immediately. Then she laughed. A short, dry sound of pure astonishment. He can't sell what he doesn't own, she said. Amelia. He has just set himself up for a disaster. Her certainty steadied me. For the first time since the call, a slow breath left my chest without trembling. She outlined the steps we would take. Notify the supposed buyer. Prepare formal action. Invalidate the sale. Expose the fraud he didn't know he had committed. Protect me fully, legally and financially. I listened, nodding as if she could see me through the phone. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't fall apart. Instead, I walked to the window, pulling aside the beige curtain to reveal the city below. Cars moved in steady lines. Office buildings glowed softly against the evening sky. A world continuing forward, unaware that mine had shifted course entirely. For the first time in months, maybe years, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not because Tyler left me. Not because the marriage ended. But because the truth had finally stepped into the light. The lies. The manipulation. The silent distance. All of it had been building toward this moment. And now, standing alone in a hotel room hundreds of miles from home, I realized something I had forgotten. I was capable of standing on my own. Tyler had broken something. But he had also freed something. I looked at my reflection in the window, tired eyes, steady expression, and whispered the thought that anchored itself quietly inside me. He thinks he ended my life today. But he has no idea what's coming. The flight home that night was one of the longest of my life, though the journey itself was barely 2 hours. The cabin lights were dim, casting long shadows across the aisle as passengers settled into their seats with soft sighs and tired movements. I sat by the window, my forehead gently touching the cold glass, watching the airport lights blur into streaks of gold as the plane pushed back from the gate. The call replayed in my mind, not as sound but as sensation. The coldness in his voice. The confidence. The laugh. The line he delivered so effortlessly. The same one that would later sit bold on a thumbnail watched by strangers across the world. My husband called me while I was visiting a client in another state. I'm divorcing you. Enjoy looking for a new place. But in that moment on the plane, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply real. Painfully, quietly real. My hands rested on my lap, fingers interlaced tightly as if I were holding myself together. I watched the twinkling lights below disappear as we rose above the clouds, the city becoming a scattered constellation beneath us. The world looked so calm from up here, untouched by the storms people carried inside them. I wondered when the storm in my own marriage had begun, because it hadn't started with the phone call. Betrayal rarely announces itself that boldly at first. It slips in through cracks that go unnoticed, tiny fissures in words, glances, routines. I thought back to the beginning, to a time when Tyler wasn't the man who could dismiss 6 years of marriage in a single breath. There was once a version of him who held my hand while crossing busy streets, who made late-night pancakes in our cramped kitchen, who whispered, "We'll figure it out," every time life felt uncertain. That man had existed. He wasn't a dream or a memory built from nostalgia. He had been real. But somewhere along the way, that man began to fade. It didn't happen suddenly. It didn't happen loudly. It happened in the quiet spaces between us. Spaces I filled with excuses because I loved him too deeply to confront the reality that was slowly taking shape. The first shift came 2 years into our marriage. Tyler began staying late at work. Not occasionally, but routinely. When I asked about it, he brushed it off with a smile and a gentle kiss on my cheek. Just a busy season, he would say. The second shift came when he stopped asking about my day. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Just absent-mindedly. His attention drifted elsewhere. His phone, his laptop, the ever-growing pile of urgent projects. The third shift was harder to ignore. The cologne that clung to him wasn't his. A softer scent. A floral one. Something delicate and unmistakably feminine. When I mentioned it, he laughed lightly and said a coworker must have hugged him during an office celebration. His explanation felt too quick, too smooth. But I swallowed my doubt because marriage, I believed, required trust. I didn't realize then that trust could become a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. The plane hummed softly around me as my memories drifted deeper. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment I stopped recognizing the person I had married. But I remembered the moment I realized the distance between us had become permanent. It was a quiet Sunday morning. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The sunlight was falling gently across his face, highlighting the lines time had begun to carve around his eyes. I asked him what he wanted for breakfast. He didn't look up from his phone. Whatever, he said. Not rude. Not angry. Just empty. It struck me then, not as pain but as a quiet ache, that the man I had built a life with no longer saw me. Not really. I had become a fixture in the background of his world, familiar but unnoticed. Still I stayed. Because love can make you hold on long after the rope has burned your hands. The plane vibrated softly as we cut through a pocket of turbulence. I straightened slightly, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine steady the chaos in my mind. When had I stopped being a partner and become a placeholder? These thoughts didn't come with bitterness. They arrived with clarity, quiet, steady, overdue. The truth had been living beneath the surface for years, waiting for the moment when I finally stopped trying to rewrite the story. Tyler's betrayal had not begun that afternoon. It had begun the moment he stopped choosing us. The moment he began building a life he didn't want me in. The moment he forgot that we had once been a team, not competitors. The woman he had chosen, the new life he had imagined, felt painfully predictable in hindsight. Men like Tyler didn't chase complexity. They chased admiration. They wanted to be adored, validated, reassured. They sought women who didn't ask hard questions, who didn't demand accountability, who made them feel powerful instead of responsible. I thought of the way he had spoken on the phone, so sure of himself, so triumphant. He had believed he was stepping into a life where he would be the hero of his own story. He didn't know his story had already begun to crumble because while he had been building an exit plan, I had unknowingly built a safeguard. The deed transfer. The refinancing. The signature he hadn't bothered to read. That oversight, his arrogance wrapped in carelessness, would become the turning point he never expected. I opened my eyes as the flight attendant walked past, checking on passengers. Outside the window the clouds glowed faintly, an endless soft expanse stretching into the horizon. It reminded me that the world, no matter how fractured my own felt, kept moving, and I would have to move with it. I rested my head back against the seat and let myself revisit the early days of our marriage, not with longing, but with acceptance. There had been love. Real love. But love alone cannot hold up an entire life. Trust, effort, mutual respect. Those are the beams that keep the structure standing. And ours had been weakening for a long time. I had fought to hold us together. He had fought to slip away. That realization softened something in me. It made the betrayal less about me and more about him. His emptiness, his insecurity, his restless need for validation. None of it had been a reflection of my worth. Women often carry the blame when a relationship shatters. We ask what we could have done differently, what we missed, what we failed to give. But sometimes the truth is painfully simple. We gave everything. They simply didn't value it. I watched the clouds drift past and placed a hand over my heart, not dramatically but gently, as if reminding myself that it was still beating, still strong, still mine. The phone call had been cruel. The words had been sharp. The delivery had been heartless. But the moment had also cracked open a truth I had been avoiding. I had loved a man who had already stopped loving me. And now for the first time in a long time I had space to breathe. Space to rebuild. Space to rediscover the woman I had been before I dimmed myself to keep the peace. As the plane began its slow descent toward home, the city lights reappeared, tiny, scattered constellations shimmering beneath the dark sky. I watched them grow brighter, closer, clearer. I knew the days ahead would not be easy. There would be confrontation. There would be unraveling. There would be moments when the weight of what he had done pressed heavily against my chest. But there would also be strength. There would be clarity. And eventually there would be peace. I straightened in my seat as the wheels touched down gently on the runway. The contact was smooth, steady, almost symbolic. I wasn't the same woman who had boarded the plane hours earlier. Something inside me had woken up. And though Tyler didn't know it yet, the moment he believed he had won was the moment he set the stage for his fall. I gathered my things, stepped off the plane, and whispered a quiet truth as I entered the terminal. He has no idea what's coming. The ride from the airport to my apartment felt strangely muted, as if the world outside the car windows had dimmed itself to match the quiet storm inside me. Streetlights stretched into long blurred strokes of gold, and the passing buildings looked like silhouettes of a life I had stepped out of hours earlier. When I finally unlocked the apartment door and stepped inside, the air felt heavier than I remembered. Tyler's jacket hung crookedly over the back of the dining chair, one sleeve touching the floor as if even fabric could mirror the carelessness of the man who left it there. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the hallway, settling into the shadows the way an echo settles after an argument. It was strange how a space could feel familiar and foreign in the same breath. How the home we built together suddenly carried the weight of unspoken truths. I set my suitcase down gently, as though any sound might disturb the fragile calm hanging in the room. For a moment I stood still, absorbing everything, the silence, the air, the small evidences of a marriage already unraveling. I moved through the apartment slowly, like someone returning to the scene of a story she hadn't realized she was living in. The kitchen counter was cluttered with unopened mail, and an empty takeout container Tyler must have dropped after one of his late-night disappearances. The living room looked untouched, yet something in its stillness felt wrong, like a stage after an actor has already left. I wondered how many nights he had spent here thinking about his new life with her, walking through this space already imagining it empty of me. The betrayal didn't hit me as a sharp stab. It spread slowly, almost politely, the way frost creeps across a window pane, claiming territory millimeter by millimeter. I didn't cry. There was too much clarity settling inside me to make room for tears. Instead, I walked to the bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed, feeling the fabric depress beneath my weight, grounding me in the present moment. The phone call replayed in my mind, not its words but its tone. That cold certainty. The lack of hesitation. The laugh. I knew I needed to speak to Chloe again. Not because I doubted the legal path ahead, but because I needed a voice of reason to match the storm of clarity building within me. When she picked up, her voice was crisp with that familiar steadiness that had anchored me through other storms in life. She told me she had already notified the buyer about the invalid sale, and the person on the other end of the transaction had been shocked and furious. It was strange how comforting that reaction felt, not because I wished anger on anyone, but because it affirmed the truth. Tyler had not outsmarted anyone but himself. Chloe explained the next steps. Formal notices, documentation, recorded proof of the deed. Her words flowed like a roadmap, guiding me through the fog that betrayal tends to create. As she spoke, I paced the bedroom, running my fingers along the edge of the dresser, grounding myself in the texture of things I owned, things I had chosen, things that were mine. When we ended the call, a kind of quiet resolve settled over me. A steady warmth that began somewhere deep in my chest and spread outward like a lantern being lit in a dark room. I realized then that hurt and strength can coexist without weakening each other. I wasn't pretending to be strong. I wasn't suppressing emotion. I was simply stepping into a truth that had been waiting for me to face it. I took a long breath and stood in front of the dresser mirror. The woman reflected back at me didn't look broken. She looked awake. Older maybe. Tired definitely. But awake in a way I hadn't felt in years. Betrayal has a way of sharpening the world, revealing details you've trained yourself to ignore. The reflection staring back at me wasn't a victim. It was a woman who had spent too long surviving quietly, finally remembering her own edge. The unraveling continued the next morning. Tyler hadn't come home overnight, and part of me wondered if he had been too embarrassed to return or too confident to feel the need to. The thought didn't sting the way it would have days earlier. Instead, it landed softly like a truth I already understood. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, leaning against the counter as the aroma filled the room. The small, mundane act felt strangely grounding. Life didn't pause for heartbreak or betrayal. It moved forward, even when you felt stuck. I sipped the warm coffee slowly, letting each swallow bring me back into myself, into my body, into the moment. I thought about the 6 years of marriage behind me, the good moments and the ones I had forced myself to paint as good. Marriage has a way of making you rewrite the story to protect the ending you want. I realized, standing there with warm coffee in my hands, that I had been rewriting for far too long. When Tyler finally walked through the door later that evening, the temperature in the apartment shifted instantly. He entered with a confidence that faltered the moment our eyes met. He looked at me, then at the legal packet on the kitchen counter, and I watched the color drain from his face. There was a moment, a brief flickering second, where I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the control he thought he had. That was when I understood the truth I hadn't been ready to face. Tyler didn't love me enough to fight for me. He only loved himself enough to fight for what he thought belonged to him. He picked up the legal notice with a trembling hand, scanning the highlighted sections, confusion bleeding into anger. He asked questions quickly, carelessly, not really wanting answers but expecting the world to rearrange itself to match the story he had written in his mind. I watched him unravel, first in disbelief, then in indignation, and finally in a kind of frustrated desperation. The unraveling wasn't mine anymore. It had shifted subtly but powerfully onto him. His voice rose. His hands shook. His composure cracked. And through it all I stood still, my silence the loudest thing in the room. When he finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could have filled it with anger or accusations or questions. But instead, I spoke with a calmness that felt almost foreign in the face of so much chaos. I told him the truth, not cruelly, not dramatically, but plainly. The deed was in my name. The sale was void. The fraud was documented. The consequences were real. His future, once so confidently planned, had shifted beneath his feet. And he had done it to himself. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself either, because I wasn't the same woman who had walked out of a conference room hours earlier to answer a phone call that was meant to destroy her. Something had shifted, softly, quietly, decisively. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity. And clarity changes everything. That night, long after he retreated to the couch in defeated silence, I sat alone in the bedroom with the lamp casting a soft circle of light across the floor. I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. A calm that didn't come from winning, but from finally seeing the truth without fear. The unraveling was still happening, thread by thread, but it wasn't my life falling apart, it was his illusion. And somewhere deep inside me, a new beginning had already taken root. The days that followed felt strangely suspended in time, as though the world had paused just long enough for me to examine my life in a clarity I had never allowed myself before. The apartment, once a lively space filled with the familiar rhythm of married routine, now carried the muted heaviness of transition. The silence felt different. Not empty, not lonely but contemplative, like the quiet before a long-awaited revelation. Every room seemed to hold echoes of moments that had once meant something, and now stood as reminders of how deeply I had ignored my own unhappiness. I found myself moving slowly through the space, tracing the edges of furniture, brushing my hands against books on the shelves, opening cupboards not because I needed something from them, but because I was reacquainting myself with the home I had lived in yet never fully claimed. It struck me how much of this apartment I had tiptoed around over the years, adjusting to Tyler's preferences, his habits, his moods. I had softened myself to fit into the spaces he carved out, and now that he was no longer the center of this world, I was seeing everything, with new eyes, new ownership, new breath. Tyler's presence, however, lingered like an uninvited guest refusing to take the hint. He wandered around the apartment with a restless agitation, switching between anger and denial as the reality of his failed scheme sank deeper into his consciousness. There were moments when he tried to reclaim the authority he believed he still had, asking pointed questions about legal documents he should have read months ago, or accusing me of manipulating him when I simply reminded him of the truth. Other times he slumped into the couch with his head in his hands, the weight of his own actions finally pressing down on him. I watched him move through these emotional swings not with satisfaction or spite, but with a sense of detachment I didn't know I was capable of. It was as if I was observing the unraveling of someone I once knew, not someone I owed anything to anymore. And in that detachment, I found the earliest spark of my own awakening. One evening after a long call with Chloe where we finalized the next steps in the divorce proceedings, I stepped onto the balcony to breathe in the cool air that drifted from the city streets below. The lights flickered across the skyline like scattered thoughts, and I felt the night settle around me gently, as though offering protection. I leaned against the railing, letting the metal cool my palms, and allowed the last traces of disbelief to drain from my body. For weeks, even months, I had known something had been wrong in my marriage, but I had fought to hold a shape that no longer existed. Now that the truth was undeniable, I felt an odd sense of relief intertwined with the grief, a quiet acknowledgement that the life I had been mourning was not the life I truly wanted anymore. It was a strange kind of freedom, one born not from triumph but from release. Tyler emerged behind me that night, the sliding door scraping softly as he stepped onto the balcony. He didn't stand close. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood there with his arms crossed, staring out at the same city that had once held our shared dreams. I didn't ask him what he was thinking. I didn't care to. But after a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke in a voice that tried to blend frustration with vulnerability. He said he didn't understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly, as if the timing was the true offense rather than the betrayal itself. He said he didn't mean for any of this to happen the way it did, as though the cruelty in his choices could be softened by regret only now that the consequences had landed squarely on him. I listened quietly, not because his words deserved attention, but because I wanted to hear the exact version of the story he told himself. He tried to paint us as two people who had simply drifted apart, who had lost connection over time, as though he hadn't severed the last thread with his own hands. When I finally turned to face him, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be buried beneath layers of arrogance, shame, and a fear he could no longer hide. But that flicker wasn't enough to resurrect anything. It wasn't enough to undo the months, the years of distance he had built. It wasn't enough to make me forget the way his voice had sounded during that phone call, cold and triumphant, when he believed he had already replaced me. I forgave him in that moment, not for him but for myself. Because forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing what he had done. It was about releasing the hold the pain had on me. I didn't tell him I forgave him. I didn't offer him closure. I simply let go internally, quietly, the way a woman does when she decides she no longer carries the burden of someone else's mistakes. That night, after Tyler retreated inside, I stayed on the balcony until the breeze grew colder and the weight of the day pulled me back into the warmth of the apartment. I walked through the hallway toward the bedroom and paused at the doorway, feeling the soft glow of the bedside lamp spill onto the floor. The room felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I had changed. I was no longer shrinking. No longer folding myself into the silence that had shaped our marriage. I was standing taller, not in body but in spirit. And the woman I saw in the mirror earlier, the woman who had looked awake for the first time in years, felt more real than ever. Over the next few days, the emotional shift inside me became even more pronounced. While Tyler unraveled with increasing desperation, I moved through the apartment with a quiet steadiness, making lists, organizing paperwork, gathering evidence, planning steps forward. Chloe guided me through each detail with unwavering confidence, her voice bringing clarity where I might have felt doubt. Tyler tried to question her decisions, inserting himself into conversations he no longer had the right to influence, but Chloe never wavered. She reminded him with firm professionalism that he had forfeited that privilege when he had taken actions that violated both our marriage and the law. Watching someone equally strong stand beside me only strengthened the resolve building inside me. And then came the moment that marked the beginning of the final shift. The moment Tyler realized the life he had envisioned with his new partner was slipping away just as swiftly as he had tried to discard ours. He received a call, one I didn't hear word for word, but the tone told me everything. Sharp, muffled, defensive. His face drained of color, his posture tightened, and he rubbed his forehead repeatedly as if trying to erase the conversation. When he hung up, he paced around the living room with frantic energy, muttering under his breath. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I could tell. His fantasy was cracking. His plans were falling apart. His new life wasn't meeting him with open arms, and suddenly the certainty he had weaponized against me evaporated into the air between us. I watched him crumble quietly, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed loosely, feeling neither pity nor pleasure, only distance. A distance that had become necessary, healthy, undeniable. That fall, the emotional collapse he experienced, wasn't something I had orchestrated. It was the consequence of his own choices. And witnessing it didn't make me feel vindicated. It made me feel free. Free from responsibility for his emotions. Free from the pressure to fix something I didn't break. Free from the weight of a marriage I had been carrying alone for far too long. The fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was subtle, quiet, a slow cracking beneath the surface. The moment he realized he no longer had control, and the moment I realized I no longer needed to justify walking away. It happened in the stillness of the apartment we once shared. In the quiet between two people who had lost the rhythm of each other long before the end arrived. And as I watched him sit down on the couch with his head in his hands, I understood something with absolute clarity. Sometimes the fall we fear is the very thing that sets us free. The morning Nicole walked into the apartment was the morning everything shifted from quiet unraveling to undeniable truth. I heard the door open while I was seated at the dining table, reviewing documents Chloe had sent the night before. The sound of unfamiliar heels clicking against the hardwood startled me in a way that felt almost symbolic. There is something profoundly revealing about hearing another woman's footsteps echo through a space you once shared with a man who promised to love you. Not because she is the threat, but because her presence uncovers the truth he tried to bury. I remained seated, my fingers lightly touching the edge of a printed page, as Tyler walked in with a forced confidence that cracked the moment our eyes met. Nicole followed closely behind him, her posture straight, her expression wearing the polished gloss of someone who believed she was stepping into a life already prepared for her comfort. She looked around the apartment with an appraising glance, the way a buyer evaluates a property she believes is already hers. And for a fleeting second I was struck by the irony. This was the apartment Tyler had claimed to have sold, the home he had tried to offer her with a bravado he didn't have the foundation to support. She gave me a brief, dismissive smile, one that assumed I was already the past, the discarded chapter. "So," she said lightly, looping her arm through Tyler's, "this is where we'll be staying for a little while?" Her tone was careless, unbothered, laced with the entitlement of someone who believed the man beside her had told her the whole truth. I watched the question hang in the air between us, watched Tyler's carefully constructed confidence falter as he waited for my reaction, hoping perhaps that intimidation or shock might give him the upper hand. But something inside me had shifted days ago. I had stepped into a reality where his actions no longer defined mine. So I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the front of my blouse in a calm, deliberate motion, and met her gaze with the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. "No," I said simply, letting the words settle like a stone dropped into still water. "This is where Tyler was staying. You won't be staying here at all." Her smile faded instantly, confusion tightening her features as she looked at him for confirmation, only to find him avoiding her eyes. That small reaction, not mine but his, told her more truth than any explanation ever could. She stepped back slightly, her polished composure beginning to crack. "What is she talking about?" she demanded softly, the edge in her voice finally revealing the insecurity beneath her confidence. Tyler opened his mouth but no words came out, and I realized then that he had never prepared for this moment. He had assumed everything would unfold on his terms. Betrayal makes people foolish in ways they don't recognize until the consequences come knocking. I answered for him, not out of cruelty, but because truth deserved a voice. I explained the deed, the refinancing, the signatures he never bothered to read. I told her the sale had been invalid from the start, that he had never legally owned the apartment at the time he claimed to sell it. And then, gently but unmistakably, I told her about the fraud he had unknowingly attempted. Nicole's face drained of color. She stepped back from Tyler as though the air around him had changed. The man she thought she was building a future with suddenly stood exposed, not as the confident provider he had pretended to be, but as someone who had tried to build a life on lies and borrowed footing. I saw the realization wash over her in layers. The embarrassment, the shock, the disappointment, the rising anger at being pulled into something she had not agreed to. "You lied," she whispered to him, each word soft and sharp. "You said this was your place. You said you sold it. You said—" She cut herself off, shaking her head as her voice trembled with a restrained fury. "Oh my God, you didn't tell me any of this." Tyler tried to salvage the situation with hurried explanations and half-formed excuses, but the more he spoke, the more she stepped away from him. And in that moment I understood something important. Women don't always turn against each other in betrayal. Often they simply see the truth. And once they see it, they don't forget it. Nicole grabbed her purse, her movements sharp and decisive, and without another glance at him, she walked out of the apartment. The door closed behind her with the quiet finality of a chapter ending. Tyler stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his breath unsteady, his hands slightly shaking. He looked at the door, then at me, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he appeared truly lost. Not angry, not triumphant, not manipulative, just lost. He lowered himself onto the couch, his shoulders collapsing inward. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice broken in a way I had never heard from him before. "Please, you don't have to do this." But he didn't understand. There was no doing left for me. He had already made every choice that led us here. I simply stopped cushioning the consequences for him. I walked toward him slowly, not with anger, but with the quiet composure of a woman who has finally stepped into the truth of her own strength. I told him calmly that the divorce papers were ready, that Chloe had everything prepared, and that all that was left was his signature. I explained that he would need to find another place to stay, that the apartment was legally mine, and that he had until the end of the day to collect his belongings. He listened with a dazed expression, each word puncturing the illusion he had built around himself. The truth wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply undeniable. His fall wasn't the violent collapse he had imagined when he feared losing control. It was something quieter, almost gentle. A slow sinking into the reality he had tried to outrun. And the more he fell, the more I rose. Not in triumph but in clarity. It struck me how the strongest revenge is often not an act of destruction, but an act of becoming. Becoming whole again. Becoming free. Becoming the woman you had forgotten in the shadow of someone else's needs. That afternoon, as he gathered his things in silence, I walked into the bedroom and stood before the window, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the buildings outside. The world continued. People laughed on the street below. A bus hissed to a stop. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life had not paused for this moment, and neither would I. When he finally stepped out of the apartment with his last box in his arms, he didn't look at me, and I didn't call after him. The door closed, not with drama, but with peace. The kind of peace that follows a long storm. The kind that feels like a deep exhale after years of holding your breath. And in that stillness, I felt it, the glow. Not the glow of victory. Not the glow of vengeance. But the glow of reclaiming myself. The glow of stepping into a life shaped by my own hands, not eroded by someone else's choices. The glow of a woman who had walked through betrayal and emerged not hardened, but illuminated. The first morning after Tyler moved out arrived with a kind of stillness I had forgotten existed. The apartment, stripped of his presence, felt different in a way I didn't fully understand at first. The silence was no longer heavy. It didn't press against my ribcage the way it once had during the final months of our marriage. Instead, it felt open, gentle, like the quiet inside a room where the windows have just been cracked open after a long season of stale air. I walked through each room slowly, barefoot, letting the coolness of the floorboards seep into my skin as if grounding me back into my own life. The sunlight spilled across the living room, stretching warm fingers across the couch, the shelves, The plants I had watered through more lonely evenings than I cared to admit. This was the same sunlight that had once illuminated the spaces between our arguments, our silences, our attempts to pretend the cracks weren't there. But now it felt like a blessing, clean, unburdened mine. I made coffee the way I used to before compromise softened my preferences. Strong, without sugar, the way my mother had made it growing up. I cupped the mug between both hands and leaned against the kitchen counter, breathing in the steam. The smell felt like a return to myself, to a version of me that had lived quietly beneath the surface, while I tried to hold together a marriage that had long been faltering. As I stood there sipping slowly, I realized something I had never admitted out loud. The loneliness inside a broken marriage is far heavier than any silence after it ends. In these walls I had spent years tiptoeing around hurt, making myself smaller to avoid another cold look, another withdrawn evening, another quiet dismissal disguised as exhaustion. Now, even though the apartment was physically emptier, it felt fuller, because I was finally present inside it. Over the next few days, I began reclaiming the space piece by piece. Not dramatically, not impulsively, just quietly, intentionally, the way someone tends to a garden that had been left unattended for seasons. I rearranged the living room furniture, moving the couch closer to the window so the afternoon light would warm it. I took down the framed jerseys and gaming prints Tyler had insisted on keeping, carefully packing them into a storage box and placing it near the door for pickup. In their place, I hung artwork I had bought years ago but never displayed because he called it too sentimental. A watercolor landscape my sister painted for me. A black and white photograph of a coastline I had always dreamed of visiting. A soft abstract canvas whose muted blues reminded me of calm waters after a storm. With each change, the apartment began to feel less like the battleground of a failing marriage, and more like a sanctuary shaped by my own hands. I scrubbed counters until they gleamed, wiped down forgotten shelves, opened windows to invite in the crisp air of late afternoon. There was something healing in the physical act of tending to a space, something grounding about rewriting a place with small, deliberate gestures. I wasn't decorating. I wasn't redecorating. I was reclaiming. Repossessing parts of myself I had surrendered without realizing. During this time, Chloe called with updates about the legal proceedings. Her voice carried the same steady confidence that had anchored me through the chaos, and each new detail she shared felt like another door closing somewhere behind me. The divorce would be finalized without complication. Tyler had no grounds to contest anything. He had no claim to the apartment, no leverage, no foundation for further conflict. The buyer he had misled wanted nothing to do with him anymore. The financial records were clear. The legal path was solid. It was all moving forward exactly as it needed to. When we ended the call, I sat on the couch for a long moment, staring at the document she had emailed. A digital symbol of closure I had once feared, now welcoming like a signpost pointing toward a future I could finally walk toward freely. There were small moments of sadness, of course. Healing never arrives without them. A memory would surface suddenly, one of the nights early in our marriage when we stayed up laughing on this very couch, or the time we painted the bedroom walls together, smearing each other with streaks of color until we collapsed in laughter. Those memories didn't sting. They softened me. They reminded me that life is not made of villains and heroes, but of people who sometimes lose their way and take others with them. I didn't resent the woman I had been back then. The woman who believed in him, who loved him, who built a life with him in good faith. I honored her. She had given everything she had. And in the end, when the truth surfaced, she had stepped aside and allowed the stronger version of herself to rise. I realized then that endings don't erase beginnings, they simply reshape them. One evening, my best friend Lauren came over with a bottle of wine and 2 takeout containers from our favorite Thai place. We sat cross-legged on the floor amidst the quiet chaos of half-packed boxes, opened windows and soft jazz playing from a speaker on the shelf. She raised her glass toward me with a knowing smile. "To fresh starts," she said. I clinked my glass gently against hers, the sound soft and satisfying. "To peace," I replied. We talked for hours, not about him but about me, the version of me she said she could finally see again. The version she told me had been dimmed for too long under the weight of a man who never understood her fully. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years, not as someone recovering from betrayal, but as someone stepping into herself again. As the days turned into weeks, the apartment continued to transform subtly. The energy shifted. The light seemed brighter. The shadows felt softer. I began waking up earlier, opening the curtains, letting sunlight wash across the room as I made breakfast in a quiet kitchen that finally felt peaceful rather than strained. I went for morning walks in the neighborhood, breathing in the cool air, observing the small details I had overlooked when my mind was cluttered with unspoken worries. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years, capturing thoughts with a gentleness that made room for growth rather than pain. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, the divorce papers arrived in my inbox, final, signed and sealed. I opened the document slowly, letting each word settle into place. There was no dramatic swell of emotion, no tears, no shaking hands. There was only a deep, steady exhale. It felt like closing the final chapter of a book I had stayed with longer than I should have. A book whose ending I had feared, but whose last page now felt quietly liberating. I whispered a simple truth aloud, not to the room but to myself. It's done. I'm free. Over time, I stopped thinking about what Tyler had taken from me and began focusing instead on what he had accidentally given me. Clarity, strength, the courage to rebuild. His choices had shattered the life I had outgrown, and in its place he had left me with an open landscape. A blank page. Space for something new to take root. I realized that the glow I felt wasn't about revenge at all. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about finding my way back to a self I had abandoned while trying to hold together a life that was no longer meant for me. Revenge hadn't burned like fire. It had arrived like light. Soft, steady, illuminating everything I had forgotten to see. On a quiet Sunday morning weeks after he had left, I stood in the living room and looked around the apartment, sunlight draping the walls softly, plants flourishing by the window, art that reflected my heart, furniture arranged in a way that felt peaceful and free. I realized then that I was no longer living in the aftermath of betrayal. I was living in the beginning of something new, something honest, something mine. And in that moment, with the warm light touching my face and the quiet hum of the city drifting through the open window, I understood entirely. The greatest glow doesn't come from being unbroken. It comes from rising piece by piece, day by day, into the woman you were always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands quiet strength. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the courage to begin again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your stories matter here.